a secluded ridge, an unzipped tent, and a shirtless stranger watching from the ferns who vanishes into a crouch. Tonight's stories will make you think twice before you ever pack a bag for a solo trip again. Welcome to Scary Hours of Darkness. We've got the top 10 Alone in the Woods horror stories lined up for you. Do us a favor and hit the like button, subscribe to join the community, and comment alone if you're watching this in the dark. Now, sit back and try to stay calm. I decided to head up to the old logging trail for a quick overnight trip. It wasn't anything fancy, just a chance to clear my head and get away from the city noise for a bit. I'd been up there a dozen times before. It's this secluded ridge that dead ends at a cliff overlook, so you never really see other hikers. It's strictly for people who know the area, and usually, that just means me. The first afternoon was perfect. I hiked in, set up my tent near the edge of the overlook, and just sat there watching the sun go down. It was completely silent. No wind, no birds, just dead quiet. I slept great that night, feeling totally safe in my usual spot. The next morning, I woke up early to gather some wood for a breakfast fire. I walked maybe 100 yards into the dense part of the forest, just collecting fallen branches. I was only gone for maybe 20 minutes, but when I walked back into my campsite, I froze. My tent flap, which I definitely zipped shut before leaving, was wide open. I dropped the wood and just stared at it. I know I zipped it. I'm paranoid about bugs getting in, so it's a habit I never break. I walked over slowly, half expecting a bear or a raccoon to be tearing up my sleeping bag inside. But it was empty. Nothing was stolen. My bag was still there, my flashlight, my food. But the feeling that washed over me was heavy. Someone had opened it. They didn't take anything. They just wanted to look inside. Or maybe they wanted me to know they had been there. I spent the next hour just sitting on a log, scanning the tree line. I tried to convince myself I'd just been forgetful, but I knew I hadn't. That feeling of being watched started to creep in, that prickly sensation on the back of your neck. The woods, which had felt peaceful the day before, now felt claustrophobic. Every tree trunk looked like it was hiding someone. I decided to cut the trip short. I didn't want to spend another night there if my mind was going to play tricks on me. But as I started breaking down the tent, I stopped. About 30 feet away, standing perfectly still in a patch of tall ferns, was a person. It was a guy, maybe in his 30s, wearing dirty jeans and no shirt. He was just standing there, facing me. He wasn't looking at my gear or the view. He was locking eyes with me. He didn't look like a hiker. He looked misplaced, like he'd just grown out of the ground. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound tougher than I felt. "Everything okay?" He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just slowly tilted his head to the side, like a dog trying to understand a noise. Then, without a sound, he dropped to a crouch, disappearing into the ferns. That was it. I panicked. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly. I just jammed it into my pack. I left the firewood where it lay. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I could hear it. I hoisted my pack and started speed walking back down the trail toward my truck. It's about a 3-mile hike out, and the sun was already starting to dip low, casting long, weird shadows across the path. About a mile in, I heard it. Snap. It came from the woods to my left, running parallel to the trail. I stopped and listened. Silence. I started walking again, faster this time. A few seconds later, I heard rustling, keeping pace with me. Someone was off the trail, moving through the brush, matching my speed. "Stop following me!" I yelled into the trees. My voice cracked a little. I didn't get an answer, but the rustling stopped. I started jogging. The heavy pack was bouncing on my back, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get to the truck. After a few minutes of jogging, I heard the noise again, but this time it was different. It sounded like heavy, slapping footsteps on the dirt. Not in the woods anymore, on the trail behind me. I spun around with my pocket knife in my hand, ready to fight. The trail behind me was empty, just a long, winding path of dirt and shadows. But the dust in the air was swirling, like someone had just run through it. I turned back around and sprinted. I ran until my lungs burned. I could hear the footsteps intermittently, sometimes behind me, sometimes off to the side, always just out of sight. It felt like I was being herded. When I finally saw the shine of my truck's bumper through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them, snatched them up from the dirt, and practically dove into the driver's seat. I locked the doors instantly. As I started the engine and threw it into reverse, my headlights swept across the tree line where the trail emerged. For a split second, in the high beams, I saw him, the shirtless man. And right next to him, peering out from behind a tree, was another face. Pale, wide-eyed, smiling way too wide. I didn't look back again. I drove down that mountain fast enough to wreck my suspension. I don't know what they were doing out there, or how long they'd been watching me before I noticed the tent, but I haven't gone camping alone since. I'm not sure I ever will again. I'm a 26-year-old landscape photographer, and at the time, I was living full-time in a converted Sprinter van. This happened last autumn, while I was making my way through the Pacific Northwest. I've always been the type of person who prefers dispersed camping over paid campsites. I hate being parked 5 feet away from an RV running a generator all night. I'd much rather be 20 miles down a logging road, where the only sound is the wind in the trees. For the most part, I felt safe. I had my routine. I locked my doors, and I usually didn't tell anyone exactly where I was. This particular night, I was in the Oregon coastal range. I had found a spot on a satellite map that looked perfect, a dead-end gravel road that opened up into a small clearing overlooking a valley. It took me about an hour of driving on rough washboard roads to get there. When I arrived, it was perfect. Dead quiet, misty, and surrounded by dense fir trees. I was the only one out there for miles. I parked the van so the nose was facing the exit, a rule I always follow, just in case I need to leave in a hurry. I spent the evening editing photos on my laptop, made some tea, and listened to a podcast. The fog rolled in heavy around 9 p.m., thick enough that I couldn't see the tree line anymore. It felt cozy, honestly. I put up my blackout shades, locked all the doors, and crawled into bed around midnight. I'm a light sleeper, especially when I'm alone. Around 2 a.m., I woke up instantly. I wasn't sure what it was at first, maybe a branch falling or an animal. But then I heard it again. It was the sound of a door handle being pulled. Specifically, the handle of my sliding door. My heart dropped into my stomach. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath. I reasoned that maybe I was dreaming, or maybe it was a raccoon scratching at the metal. But then I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel, moving from the side door toward the front passenger door. I slowly sat up and reached for the bear spray I keep mounted by the bed. I stayed silent. The handle on the passenger door clicked as someone tried to open it. Locked, obviously. Then there was a pause. "Hello?" a voice called out. It was a man's voice, calm but loud enough to be heard through the insulation. "Hey, I see your vent fan is on. I know you're in there." I didn't say anything. The rule of thumb for solo female travelers is usually to stay quiet so they don't know you're a woman, or to bark like a big dog if you have one. I didn't have a dog. "I'm hurt," the man said. "My truck slid off the road a few miles back. I need help. I don't have cell service." This sent a chill down my spine because I hadn't heard a vehicle. No engine noise, no tires on gravel. Unless he walked 5 miles in the pitch dark without a flashlight, he was lying. And if he did walk, why wasn't he out of breath? I crept to the front of the van, staying below the window line. I have a small gap in my curtain where I can peek out. I looked through the passenger window. It was pitch black because of the fog, but I could make out a silhouette standing right by the door. He was wearing a dark hoodie. He wasn't holding his arm or limping. He was just standing there, staring at the glass. Then I saw movement behind him. About 10 feet back, near the edge of where the clearing met the road, there was another shape. A second person was standing perfectly still in the fog, watching. If the first guy was really hurt and needed help, why was his friend hiding in the dark? "Please," the guy at the door said, and his tone changed. It wasn't pleading anymore. It was impatient. "Open the door. I just need to use a phone." He tried the handle again, violently this time, shaking the whole van. I didn't wait. I jumped into the driver's seat. I didn't bother taking down the window shades. I just grabbed the keys from the cup holder and jammed them into the ignition. "I have a gun!" I screamed, which was a lie, but I hoped it would make them hesitate. As the engine roared to life, the guy at the window slammed his fist against the glass hard enough that I thought it would shatter. I threw the van into drive and flipped on my high beams and my off-road floodlights. The sudden blast of light illuminated everything. The guy at the door flinched and covered his eyes, stumbling back. But the light also caught the second figure in the road, and a third one I hadn't even seen, crouching near my back bumper. They were all dressed in dark clothes. I floored it. I could hear the tires spinning in the loose gravel before they caught traction. The van fishtailed, and I heard a loud thump on the side panel. I think the guy near the door tried to grab the ladder, or hit the metal as I sped past. I didn't slow down. I drove down that winding logging road way faster than was safe, hitting potholes that shook the whole frame. I watched my rearview mirror the whole time, expecting to see headlights chasing me, but nobody followed. They must have parked their vehicle somewhere hidden further down the trail to ambush whoever came up. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway and found a 24-hour truck stop with bright lights and cameras. I sat there shaking for an hour before I called the police. They sent a patrol car out to check the road the next morning, but it didn't find anyone. Instead, they found some tire tracks and footprints in the mud. I still live in my van, but I no longer venture down dead-end roads without cell service, and I definitely don't sleep without a weapon nearby. When I was 16, I had a summer job working at a community pool about 3 miles from my house. We lived in a semi-rural area where the subdivisions were separated by large patches of dense, undeveloped forest. My parents were always pretty strict about me sticking to the main roads, even though it took twice as long to walk. But being a teenager who valued sleep over safety, I usually ignored them. There was a utility trail that cut directly through the woods behind an old elementary school. It shaved about 20 minutes off my commute, so I took it almost every day. It was a narrow, overgrown dirt path that wound through thick brush and tall pines. It was always a little spooky, mostly because the tree canopy was so thick that it blocked out a lot of the sunlight, leaving the trail in a permanent twilight even at noon. Looking back, I realize how stupid I was, but at that age, you just don't think anything bad can actually happen to you. For the first month of summer, the walk was uneventful. I'd put my headphones in, keep one earbud out just in case, and power walk through the trees until I popped out near the pool. But one Tuesday afternoon, things felt different. I was about halfway through the woods, at the deepest point of the valley, when I saw something on the trail ahead of me. It was a single, pristine white sneaker. It was sitting perfectly upright in the middle of the dirt path, facing me. It wasn't there when I walked to work that morning, and it looked brand new, not like trash someone had dumped. I froze. A cold feeling washed over me instantly. It felt staged, like bait. I wanted to turn around and run back to the school, but I was closer to the exit near the pool, and I knew if I turned my back, I'd have to run uphill. So, I decided to keep moving forward, but I pulled my headphones out completely and stuffed them in my pocket. My heart was hammering against my ribs. The woods were dead silent. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it. Snap. It came from behind me, maybe 20 yards back. I tried to convince myself it was a squirrel or a deer, but the rhythm was wrong. I kept walking, trying to keep my pace steady, but I was straining my ears to listen. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps, heavy ones, and they were matching my pace perfectly. I decided to test it. I stopped abruptly, pretending to tie my shoe. The footsteps behind me didn't stop instantly. There was one final heavy thud before silence, like someone had taken one step too many before realizing I had stopped. That was the moment I knew I was in trouble. I wasn't just being paranoid, I was being hunted. My stomach dropped, but weirdly enough, a strange calm took over. I knew the trail better than whoever was behind me. I knew that about 100 yards ahead, the dirt path turned into a paved bike lane that led straight to the pool parking lot. I didn't turn around. I knew if I looked back and saw someone, I might freeze up. I started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps behind me started up immediately, faster and louder now. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They knew that I knew. I'm not a big person, but I played varsity soccer. I had explosive speed, and I knew I could sprint for a long time if I had to. I just needed to get to the flat ground. I kept my eyes locked on the opening in the trees ahead where the sunlight was brighter. The footsteps behind me got closer. I could hear the rustle of fabric now, maybe 10 feet back. As soon as my boots hit the flat, hard-packed dirt near the exit, I took off. I didn't wind up or give a warning. I just bolted. I heard a curse from behind me, a deep, guttural male voice, and then the sound of heavy boots pounding the dirt. He was chasing me. I didn't look back. I pumped my arms and ran harder than I had ever run in a game. The brush whipped against my face, scratching my cheeks, but I didn't care. I burst out of the tree line and onto the pavement, sprinting straight toward the busy parking lot of the pool. I didn't stop running until I was literally inside the lobby, gasping for air, hands on my knees. I spun around to look out the glass doors, but the tree line was empty. Whoever it was had stopped at the edge of the woods. I never saw the man, and I never found out whose shoe that was. I didn't tell my parents until years later because I knew they'd just say, "I told you so." But I never took that shortcut again. I walked the long way on the main road for the rest of the summer, every single day. So, I recently bought a used aluminum flat-bottom boat, and my best friend Mike and I have been obsessed with taking it out to the local river delta. We're in southern Alabama, so there are miles of winding creeks and bayous that hardly anyone touches. It's usually peaceful, just us and the mosquitoes. But last weekend we decided to push further upstream than we usually go, looking for some untouched base spots. We found this narrow tributary that was almost completely hidden by hanging moss and overgrown cypress trees. We jokingly called it the chute because the current picked up right at the entrance. Mike was steering the trolling motor, and I was up front casting. As we moved deeper into this channel, the sun started to get blocked out by the canopy, and the whole vibe just shifted. It went from a sunny Saturday afternoon to something darker and quieter. About 20 minutes in, the creek split around a small, muddy island. I looked back at Mike, and he just shrugged and pointed to the right side, which looked a little deeper. So, We veered right. That's when things started to feel really off. The cicadas, which had been deafening a few minutes ago, just stopped. It was dead silent. We were drifting near a high mud bank, probably 6 or 7 feet above the waterline, when we heard it. It started as a weird clicking sound coming from the thick brush on top of the bank. At first, I thought maybe it was a heron or some kind of waterfowl, but then the clicking turned into this low, guttural vibration that I could feel in my chest. Mike cut the trolling motor immediately. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I said, gripping my fishing rod a little tighter. "Is that a gator?" "Gators don't make that sound," Mike said, his eyes scanning the tree line. Suddenly, the brush on top of the bank exploded outward. We both jumped. Something massive was tearing through the palmettos, heading straight for the edge of the cliff. It sounded heavy, way too heavy to be a deer or a wild pig. The footsteps were rhythmic and pounding. Thud, 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 getting faster. We braced ourselves, expecting a wild boar to come tumbling down the bank. But what came out was... I still don't know how to describe it. It was pale, almost gray, and it moved on all fours. But its limbs looked too long, like they had too many joints. It didn't look like a dog or a cat. It looked smooth, like wet rubber. It crested the bank at full speed and launched itself into the air, aiming straight for the water right off the bow of our boat. It was huge, easily the size of a man. I flinched, waiting for the massive splash that would soak us and rock the boat. But the splash never came. The thing hit the water's surface, and instead of a crash, there was just a sound like a pebble being dropped in a pond. Bloop. Barely a ripple. Mike and I just stared at the water. It was murky brown, but we were shallow enough that we should have seen the wake or the mud being stirred up. We waited for it to surface. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Nothing. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It didn't splash," Mike said, looking pale. "How did it not splash?" We grabbed the paddles, didn't even want to use the noisy motor, and poked at the water where it went in. It was maybe 4 feet deep there. If a 100-pound animal dove in, we would have felt it bump the boat or seen the water churning. But the surface was glass calm. We sat there for another minute, scanning the banks, waiting for this gray thing to climb out or pop up for air. But the woods remained dead silent. It was like the creature had just evaporated the second it touched the surface. We didn't fish anymore that day. Mike fired up the main outboard, risking the prop on the shallow logs, and we tore out of there as fast as that little boat would go. We've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe it was an otter and the angle was weird, or maybe it was just a trick of the light and shadows. But we both know what we saw. Something huge jumped into the water and didn't displace a single drop. We stick to the main river channel now. So, this happened about 3 years ago during archery season here in Oregon. I was scouting a new area deep in the Cascade foothills, a place called Roaring Creek. I had been talking to an old guy at the local archery shop a few days prior, telling him my plan to hike back into this specific drainage that looked good on the maps. He got really quiet when I mentioned the creek. He told me that locals don't really hunt back in there. He said, "The elk go in, but they don't stay, and neither should you." He wouldn't elaborate, just said there's a reason it's always quiet. Being young and stubborn, I brushed it off. I figured he was just trying to protect his own honey hole or keep a newbie out of a good spot. I'm pretty fit, so I packed my frame pack for a solo overnight trip, planning to spike camp way back in so I could be sitting on a wallow at sunrise. I hiked about 5 miles. The terrain was brutal, blowdowns everywhere, and steep shale slides. But when I got to the basin, it looked perfect. There were fresh rubs and tracks everywhere, so I knew animals were in the area. I set up my small tent and got settled. That evening, I was sitting on a hillside, gazing at the opposite slope. It was that golden hour right before dark. Despite all the signs, I hadn't seen a single animal all day, which was weird. Suddenly, the wind shifted, and the woods went dead silent. No squirrels, no birds, nothing. It felt heavy, like the air pressure dropped. I scanned the tree line below me with my binoculars. I caught movement in a patch of dark timber. At first, I thought it was a bull elk raking a tree. I could see the dark brown color and the shaking of a small fir tree. I got my rangefinder up to check the distance. When I focused in, my stomach turned over. It wasn't an elk. It was standing upright on two legs, holding onto the tree trunk. It was massive, covered in dark, matted hair, but the face was what got me. It didn't have a snout like a bear. It had a flat, pale face, almost human, but the eyes were wide set and completely black. It was looking up the hill, scanning right where I was sitting. I was fully camouflaged, sitting still as a rock, but I felt like it could see right through me. It let go of the tree and took a step out into the open. The stride was impossible. It must have covered 6 feet in a single step without even trying. It looked unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by strings. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I didn't even care about being quiet anymore. I grabbed my bow, left my tent and sleeping bag right where they were, and just started backing up the ridge. Once I broke the line of sight, I turned and practically ran down the mountain in the dark. I risked breaking an ankle on the loose rock, but the fear was primal. I felt like prey. I made it back to my truck around 2 a.m., exhausted and scratched up. I never went back for my gear. That tent was expensive, but no amount of money could pay me to walk back into that basin alone. I told the old guy at the shop about it later, and he didn't even look surprised. He just nodded and said, "I told you, I hunt different units now, closer to the roads where there are other people." I honestly don't know how to categorize what we saw that night. There is no reference point in my brain for a living thing that occupies space the way that figure did. This was back in the late 90s, right before I left for the military. I was spending my last summer of freedom with my best friend, heavy on the freedom part and light on the responsibility. We spent most of our nights driving around the back roads of West Virginia, looking for old mines or just finding spots to park and talk about what the hell we were going to do with our lives. My buddy, Alan, drove this beat-up Ford Bronco that was more rust than paint. We were exploring a fire trail that cut through a dense section of the Monongahela National Forest. It was late, probably pushing midnight, and the moon was completely obscured by a thick blanket of clouds. It was pitch black out there, the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face without artificial light. We had been driving for maybe 40 minutes, winding deeper into the hollows, when the trail started to narrow aggressively. The rhododendrons were scraping the sides of the truck, screeching against the metal like nails on a chalkboard. We decided it was getting too tight and we needed to head back before we got stuck or blew a tire. Alan spotted a small logging turnaround up ahead, just a widening in the trail where the gravel gave way to mud and weeds. He pulled the Bronco into the clearing and started to execute a 3-point turn. As he shifted from reverse to drive, the high beams swept across the tree line on the passenger side. That's when the world just stopped. Alan slammed on the brakes so hard that I slammed into the dashboard. Neither of us said a word. We were just frozen, staring out the passenger window at the edge of the woods. Standing there, right at the perimeter of the clearing, was a figure. It had to be at least 9 feet tall. It was impossibly thin, elongated like taffy being pulled apart. But the height wasn't the part that made my stomach turn over. It was the composition of the thing. It was black. Not just dark, but a total, absolute void. The headlights from the Bronco were hitting it, but they weren't illuminating it. It was like the light was being swallowed. Where there should have been the texture of clothing or fur or skin, there was just nothing. It looked like someone had taken an X-Acto knife and cut a silhouette out of reality, revealing an infinite emptiness behind it. It had the rough shape of a man, a head, shoulders, long arms that hung down past its knees, but there were no features, no eyes, no mouth, no definition. It was just a tear in the fabric of the night. "What is that?" Alan whispered, his voice sounding like it was being squeezed out of a tight throat. "I don't know," I said, unable to look away. "It's not reflecting." That was the only way I could describe it. The light just died when it hit the shape. The figure didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there, towering over the brush, radiating this intense feeling of malice. It felt like the air around the truck had dropped 20 degrees in a second. I felt a primal urge to vomit, a deep, biological rejection of what I was seeing. Suddenly, the figure seemed to shimmer, or maybe my eyes were just failing to comprehend it. The edges of the blackness vibrated, and it took a step toward the truck. It didn't walk. It glided, the void expanding as it moved closer. "Go!" I screamed. "Alan, go!" Alan didn't need telling twice. He stomped on the gas. The tires spun in the mud for a terrifying second, slinging sludge everywhere, before they caught traction on the gravel. We fishtailed out of that clearing and tore back down the trail, bouncing so hard I thought the suspension would snap. We didn't slow down until we hit the state highway 10 miles later. We pulled onto the shoulder under a street lamp and just sat there, shaking. We checked the truck, half expecting to see claw marks or black residue, but there was nothing, just mud. We never really talked about it in detail. We tried once, a few days later, but Alan got pale and shut the conversation down immediately. He said talking about it made him feel like he was listening. That was the last summer I really spent with him. I shipped out for basic training in August. Alan stayed behind. He started falling apart pretty quickly after that. He got into heavy drugs, stuff we never touched back then. It was like he was trying to numb something he couldn't escape. 2 years later, I got a letter from his mom. Alan had walked into the woods behind his house one night and never came back out. They found his body a week later in a ravine. The coroner ruled it exposure mixed with a cocktail of substances, but I've always wondered. I think back to that void we saw in the clearing. I think about how it swallowed the light, and I can't help but feel that whatever that thing was, it marked him. It waited for him. I escaped because I left, but Alan stayed in the dark. I wouldn't call myself a survivalist, but my brother David has dragged me on enough trips that I can handle a few nights in the woods. In early October 2019, we drove up to the Adirondacks to spend a long weekend near the high peaks. We wanted isolation, so we bypassed the popular trailheads and hiked into a primitive site near a narrow, fast-moving creek. We set up camp around 4 p.m. The air was crisp, smelling of decaying leaves and wet earth. After a dinner of jerky and dehydrated stew, we sat by the fire, watching the smoke drift up into the canopy. The forest was loud with the usual sounds: crickets, the rushing water, the wind in the hemlocks. Around 10:30, the fatigue hit us, so we put out the fire and crawled into the tent. I slept heavily until something jolted me awake. The silence was absolute. The crickets had stopped. The wind had died. Then I heard it, a rhythmic, metallic clink against stone. It was coming from the creek bed, maybe 50 yards away. Clink, clink, splash. I nudged David, but he was already awake, staring at the tent ceiling. "Bear?" he whispered. I shook my head. Bears are noisy, clumsy. This was precise. We lay there for an hour, listening to that steady sound moving slowly upstream, away from us. It sounded like someone striking rocks together, over and over. Eventually, it faded into the distance. We broke camp at first light. The morning was gray and foggy, the woods feeling closed in. We decided to hike out along the creek bank rather than the main trail. About half a mile upstream, David stopped. Wedged between two large boulders in the middle of the water was a backpack. It wasn't drifting. It was weighed down with rocks. David waded out, the water freezing against his calves, and pulled it free. It was a heavy trekking pack, soaked through. He hauled it to the bank. We didn't open it. It felt wrong to pry, but I saw a luggage tag on the handle. J. Miller, Boston. On the shore nearby, we saw the stones. Someone had arranged river rocks in a perfect circle, maybe 3 feet wide. In the center lay a pair of glasses, the lenses smashed out. The feeling of dread was immediate and cold. We left everything exactly as it was, marked the GPS coordinates, and hiked out at a pace that was almost a run. We drove straight to the nearest ranger station. A stern woman named Ranger Davis took our statement. She stared at the photo I'd taken of the backpack for a long time before asking us exactly what time we heard the noises. She didn't tell us anything, just thanked us and told us to drive safely. 3 days later, I saw the article online. A 24-year-old student named Justin Miller had been reported missing by his family a week earlier. He had driven up for a solo photography trip and never checked out of his hostel. The search was focused on a completely different ridge, miles from where we were. I emailed a link to the ranger station, but I never got a reply. The article was updated a month later to say the search had been suspended. They found his pack, but they never found him. I still go hiking, but I don't camp near water anymore. I can't shake the memory of that rhythmic clinking sound in the dark, or the sight of those glasses sitting in the center of that stone circle, waiting to be found. My name is Thomas Vance. I am 52 years old, and I've been hunting the steep ridges of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia for over 30 years. Hunting in these mountains is not for the casual sportsman. The terrain is unforgiving, the weather turns on a dime, and you are often miles from the nearest cell signal. This particular event happened 2 years ago during late archery season. I hunt a specific area known as the Cranberry Wilderness. It is rugged, dense, and feels ancient. This morning, I had hiked about 3 miles back into a deep hollow where I knew a large buck had been bedding down. I found my tree, a sturdy white oak, and used my climbing stand to get about 20 feet up. By 6:15 a.m., I was locked in, safety harness on, waiting for the gray light of dawn. For the first few hours, it was a textbook morning. The squirrels woke up, the birds started calling, and the woods came alive. But around 9 a.m., everything changed. It didn't happen gradually. It was instant. The birds stopped chirping. The squirrels, which had been chasing each other around my tree, vanished. A heavy, oppressive silence blanketed the hollow. In 3 decades of hunting, I have only felt that kind of silence a handful of times, usually right before a severe storm or when a predator is very close. I scanned the rhododendron thickets below me, expecting to see a coyote or a black bear. We have plenty of bears in West Virginia, and I've harvested several. I know how they move. They shuffle. They are loud, breaking sticks and huffing as they forage. What I heard next was not a shuffle. It was a rhythmic, heavy, 2-footed cadence coming from the ridge above me. Thump, thump, thump. I instinctively grabbed my bow, thinking maybe another hunter was walking in on me, which is rare that deep in the woods. I watched the ridgeline. About 60 yards up the slope, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from behind a massive hemlock tree. My brain tried to process it as a man in a ghillie suit, but the proportions were all wrong. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, and broad at the shoulders with no visible neck. It was covered in dark, matted hair that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It didn't walk like a man trying to be quiet. It walked with total confidence. It covered the ground in long, fluid strides, navigating the deadfall and rocks without stumbling. It came down the slope and stopped about 40 yards from my tree. I stopped breathing. I was terrified that the sound of my heartbeat would give me away. Then, the wind shifted, and the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of a bear or a wet dog. It was a pungent, stinging odor, like skunk mixed with rotting garbage. It made my eyes water. The creature stood perfectly still, its back to me, staring down into the creek bottom. Then, slowly, it turned its upper body. It looked up. Not around, not scanning, it looked directly at my face. I was 20 feet up, camouflaged and motionless, yet it locked eyes with me instantly. Its face was dark, the skin like old leather, with deep-set eyes that conveyed a terrifying intelligence. There was no fear in those eyes, only dominance. We held that gaze for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only 10 seconds. Then, it opened its mouth and let out a sound I can only describe as a guttural chatter, almost like a language, deep in its chest. It wasn't a growl. It sounded like it was speaking to something else nearby. Suddenly, it reached out with a massive arm and shoved a standing dead tree, probably 6 inches in diameter. The tree snapped with a report like a rifle shot and crashed to the forest floor. It was a display of power that no man could replicate. Without looking at me again, it turned and walked back up the ridge, moving with a speed that shouldn't be possible for something of that size. I didn't climb down for an hour. I sat there, shaking, my bow still gripped in my white-knuckled hand. When I finally descended, I didn't look for tracks. I didn't investigate the broken tree. I packed my stand on my back and walked out of those woods with my release aid in one hand and my hunting knife in the other, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't tell my hunting buddies. I knew how it would sound. A month later, I mentioned to an old game warden friend of mine that I'd seen something strange in the cranberry. He didn't laugh. He just nodded and told me that people see things in those mountains that don't make it into the official reports. He said the mountains are old and they keep their secrets. I still hunt because it's part of who I am, but I don't go into the deep hollows of the cranberry wilderness anymore. I stick to the edges, closer to the roads. And I never go into the woods without the heavy realization that while I might be a hunter, I am not the apex predator I once thought I was. There is something else out there, something that walks these ridges with an ownership we can only pretend to understand. At that time, I was living in upstate New York, working double shifts at a warehouse that left me physically exhausted but mentally restless. Whenever I could scrape together 2 days off, I tried to disappear into the Adirondacks for a night or two, convincing myself that the silence of the mountains was the only thing that could keep me sane. I also know that a large part of you won't believe what we saw that night, but the truth is that we did see it, and even though we don't understand it, all 3 of us know without any doubt that it was real. That particular trip wasn't planned impulsively. It wasn't something I did alone, because I was joined by 2 close friends, people I trusted completely, both physically capable and experienced outdoors to the point where none of us felt even remotely concerned about safety. We chose a remote stretch of forest, one we had scouted on a map but never actually visited, and although it was deep enough to feel isolated, it wasn't far from a service road, which gave us a false sense of reassurance. We arrived in the late afternoon, hiked for a couple of hours, and set up camp just as the light started to fade. And everything about the environment felt normal, almost disappointingly so, with the air cold but manageable. The forest was quiet except for the occasional wind moving through the trees, and absolutely nothing to suggest that the night ahead would be any different from the dozens of other nights we had spent outdoors together. We cooked, ate, talked for a while, and eventually settled into our sleeping bags, confident that the hardest part of the trip was already behind us. At some point during the night, I woke up because the silence felt heavy. Usually, you hear crickets, wind, or the settling of the woods, but this was a vacuum of sound that pressed against my ears. Since I wasn't fully awake and there was no real reason for me to get up, I stayed where I was, suspended in that half-asleep state, still drowsy but slightly alert. That was when, somewhere just outside the clearing, I thought I heard a hum. I sat up immediately, confused, convincing myself that I was hearing the wind through a hollow log. As my awareness sharpened, I became conscious of a light outside the tent. Not a flashlight beam or the flicker of a dying fire, but a steady, pale blue glow that seemed to permeate the fabric of the tent. Could it have been another hiker? I looked around and saw that both of my friends were still inside the tent with me. I focused on their breathing, trying to calm myself and convince myself that I was overreacting. But one by one, I felt them wake up as well, not through words or obvious movement, but through that subtle shift in the air, the shared tension that settles in when multiple people realize that something isn't right. I asked them in a whisper if they saw the light, and both of them nodded, their eyes wide and reflecting the strange glow. That was when we heard a sound that I have never been able to forget, made even worse by the fact that we were miles from civilization in the dead of night. It sounded like a choir of children laughing, but the audio was distorted, like a record being played backward and slowed down. It didn't sound human at all, and I honestly believe that if they hadn't been there with me, and if all three of us hadn't heard it, I would have doubted my own sanity. That was when David, one of my friends, decided he was going to unzip the tent flap just an inch to try to understand what was happening. I felt completely petrified where I was because I'm the only one in the group who had grown up hearing stories about these woods, and what we were experiencing felt exactly like those warnings coming to life. I was absolutely terrified. David froze with his hand on the zipper, and with the most trembling, hollow voice I've ever heard come out of another human being, whispered that something was standing by the ashes of our fire. The distorted laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound of wet footsteps on dry leaves. I leaned forward to look through the small gap David had made, and that was when I saw it. It was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, dressed in what looked like tattered gray rags that moved as if they were underwater. It had no face, just a smooth surface where features should have been, yet I knew it was looking at us. In that moment, I knew that one of two things was true. Either I was hallucinating from exhaustion, or we were in the presence of something that biology could not explain. My friends recoiled, scrambling back against the far wall of the tent, and that was when I saw the figure raise a hand, and the pale blue light intensified, blinding us for a split second. I didn't need to see anything else. I immediately said that we had to get out of there. I didn't care about our gear. I didn't care about the hike back in the dark. I just wanted to leave. There was no discussion. Both of them agreed with me instantly. We grabbed our car keys and flashlights, cut through the back mesh of the tent with a pocket knife, and took off running into the dark timber, away from the campsite. As I ran, I was terrified of tripping over a root, because I felt completely out of control, sprinting through dense brush with a beam of light that didn't stay steady, bouncing wildly with every step I took. Fortunately, the adrenaline pushed us faster than we had ever hiked, and in less than 40 minutes, we were at the truck, fumbling with the keys and tearing out of the gravel lot as fast as the engine would go. To this day, I still don't understand what I saw. I don't understand the light, and I don't understand what that faceless figure was. All I know is that it didn't belong in nature, and that distorted laughter is so deeply embedded in me that I'm certain I could be old and still hear it echoing inside my head. We never went camping again, and we never went back to retrieve our tents. I regret the loss of innocence because the woods were something I truly loved. But like I said before, I believe there are layers to this world we don't see, and those mountains hide things that we are not meant to find. I am documenting this account because my therapist suggested that externalizing the trauma might stop the recurring nightmares. My name is David, and I am a 35-year-old structural engineer. I deal in physics, concrete, and absolute certainties. I do not believe in ghosts, and I have never had an interest in folklore. What occurred between September 12th and September 15th, 2023, in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness of northern Minnesota is a factual record of events that I cannot explain with logic. I was accompanied by my younger sister, Maya. We have been canoeing the Boundary Waters since we were teenagers. We are competent swimmers, experienced navigators, and we know how to handle the isolation of the backcountry. We entered at a remote access point off the Gunflint Trail at 7 a.m. On September 12th, the forecast was clear, with highs in the mid-60 seconds, perfect weather for a late-season paddle. We covered about 12 miles the first day, crossing 3 lakes and 2 portages. We set up camp on a small island in the middle of a deep, iron-dark lake. The first anomaly occurred at 8:45 p.m. that night. The sun had set, and the lake was dead calm. In the Boundary Waters, sound carries across the water with perfect clarity. We were sitting by the fire when we heard the distinct sound of a paddle dipping into the water. Dip, pull, drip, dip, pull, drip. It was the rhythmic cadence of a solo paddler moving with purpose. We looked out at the lake, which was illuminated by a waxing crescent moon. There was nothing. The surface was like black glass. The sound continued, getting louder, as if a canoe were passing within 10 feet of our shoreline. I shone my 1,000 lumen flashlight onto the water. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty surface. The moment the light hit the water, the paddling sounds stopped mid-stroke. There was no splash, no drift, just an abrupt cessation of noise. Maya asked me if sound could echo strangely off the cliffs, but there were no cliffs nearby. We slept poorly. On the morning of September 13th, we found the second inconsistency. We had hung our food bag on a sturdy pine branch about 100 yards from the tents, following bear safety protocols. When we went to retrieve it at 6:30 a.m., the rope was still tied, but the bag was sitting on the ground directly below the branch. The rope hadn't been cut or untied. It was simply slack. But what was disturbing was the circle around the bag. In the pine needles, someone or something had drawn a perfect geometric circle, about 6 feet in diameter. It wasn't scuffed into the dirt. It looked like the needles had been individually rearranged to form a raised ridge. Inside the circle, the air smelled intensely of ozone, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. We packed up quickly and moved on, paddling deeper into the restricted zone where motors are prohibited. At 1 p.m., we stopped for lunch on a granite outcropping. Maya went to filter water while I checked the map. That's when the mimicry started. I heard Maya's voice behind me, clear as a bell. She said, "David, come look at this turtle." I turned around. Maya was down by the water's edge, about 50 feet away, with her back to me. The voice had come from the woods, directly behind my left shoulder. I stood up and walked toward the tree line. "Maya?" I called out. Down by the water, the real Maya turned around, looking confused. "Yeah?" I froze. "Did you just say something about a turtle?" She shook her head. No, I haven't said a word in 10 minutes. I backed away from the trees. As I did, a sound came from the dense brush, a low, wet clicking noise, followed by a voice that was a perfect recording of my own. It said, "Did you just say something about a turtle?" It wasn't mocking, it was practicing. The intonation was flat, devoid of the confusion I had just felt. We got back in the canoe and paddled hard, putting 3 miles between us and that island before we spoke again. The final night, September 14th, was when reality seemed to break. We camped on a peninsula with a clear view of the water on 3 sides. At 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of zipping. I lay still, listening. It was the sound of a tent zipper going up and down, rapidly. Zip up, zip down, zip up, zip down. I thought it was Maya. I called out her name softly. The zipping stopped. Then, from directly outside the thin nylon wall of my tent, inches from my face, a voice whispered, "David." It was Maya's voice, but it was wrong. It sounded like Maya's voice if it were being played through a speaker submerged in water. "David," it whispered again. "Open the door. The water is warm." I grabbed my knife and unzipped the door, shining my light outward. There was no one there. I looked over at Maya's tent. 10 feet away, it was zipped shut. I scrambled over and shook her tent. She woke up with a gasp, terrified. She had been asleep the whole time. We didn't sleep again. We sat back to back by the fire pit until dawn. At first light, we packed in silence. As we were loading the canoe, I looked down at the wet sand on the beach. There were footprints. They started at the water's edge, walked up to my tent, circled it twice, and then walked back into the water. But they weren't human footprints. They looked like human hands, long fingers, an opposable thumb where the heel should be pressed deep into the sand, as if something had been walking on its palms. The prints were huge, easily 14 inches long. We paddled the remaining 8 miles to the entry point in a sprint. We didn't stop to eat. We didn't stop to rest. We heard heavy splashes behind us the entire way, always just out of sight around the bend, but we never looked back. We drove 5 hours straight to Minneapolis without turning on the radio. We reported the incident as a potential bear stalking to the ranger station, leaving out the voices. They took a report but didn't seem surprised. I thought it was over, but 2 days ago, I was backing up my GoPro footage from the trip to my hard drive. I found a video file from September 13th, the day of the lunch stop. The camera had been mounted to the front of the canoe, facing backward at me in the stern, and Maya in the bow. The video shows us paddling across a wide stretch of calm water. The timestamp is 11:42 a.m. In the video, we are paddling in sync, but as I watched, my blood ran cold. Behind me, in the stern of the canoe, there is a reflection in the water. The angle of the sun casts my shadow on the surface, but there is a second shadow rising behind mine. It is a tall, elongated silhouette sitting in the canoe behind me, where there is no seat. Its arms are impossibly long, and they are moving in a paddling motion, mimicking my strokes perfectly. I zoomed in on the frame. The thing has no face. Its head is just a smooth, pale oval. But the most terrifying part is that in the video, every time I turn my head to check our bearing, the shadow stops moving instantly, freezing until I look forward again. I realized then that the extra weight I had felt in the canoe that entire trip wasn't just gear. It rode with us. It learned our voices. It learned our names. And now, at night, when my house settles and the floorboards creak, the sound doesn't come from the settling wood. It comes from the hallway, and it sounds exactly like the wet, rhythmic slap of a paddle hitting water, getting closer to my bedroom door. That brings us to the end of the trail. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to Scary Hours of Darkness for more true horror. If you have a story of your own paranormal, cryptid, or a stranger danger encounter, send it over to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. Sleep well, and try not to look out the window tonight.